the Wuhan coronavirus, and that's wreaking havoc across the country. The government refused to apply world's best practice. They went into a lockdown when world best practice said, don't go into a lockdown. They forced that on the country, and it's being borne not by the public service. It's not being borne by the politicians, and the public service and the politicians, excluding the frontline people, over 2 million people. They're being supported by the rest of us, and the situation is terrible. We have approaching 1 million unemployed. We have 2 million small businesses with families, husbands and wives and children. And then we have about 6 million people on this job seeker. The people on job seeker, they realize at the last minute we're about to be sacked. So they've been sort of saved in a highly flawed scheme. And then there's another 6 million who've still got their jobs and wondering whether the politicians will destroy those. The country's in a mess it never needed to be, because world's best practice tells us you don't have to have a lockdown. You just are very strict on entry, which we weren't. And we've seen that in relation to the ships that have come in, but also in relation to the planes. And they let that go on for 2 months and they let too many in. The result has been, with the improper handling of the old people's homes, the result has been we've got 20 times as many deaths as Taiwan has. They're world's best practice, about the same population, very close to China. They don't have the advantage of being remote as we are, and they still have only 6 deaths. We've got almost 100. And we've got everybody thrown out of work, and now the politicians are talking about going back and they're prescribing ridiculous rules. 10 people only in a restaurant, no matter how big the restaurant is. 10 people in a vast cathedral. It's all very ridiculous. They've mismanaged it, and they've mismanaged it severely. And as you've pointed out to me, there's an enormous debt that will have to be paid off. The situation is appalling. Peter.
Yeah, you're so correct, Professor, and it's great to have this chat. If we have a look at this money that's being dished out, where has that money come from? Number one, is it all borrowed money? Number two, what I can't get my head around, David, is over here in South Australia, we've got hairdressers that can open. So if this Chinese virus is so contagious, my daughter's got her own hairdressing salon, actually, and you're in there in an enclosed environment, indoors, but you can't, be in a cafe when this first come out, 1.5 metre distance apart, or you couldn't go to church or go to a hotel, but these hairdressers are actually touching people. I just can't get, it's very inconsistent what's going on. And another thing as well is, if we have a look at influenza, in 2017, 250,000 people were infected by influenza. There was 1,163 deaths. Now, you imagine if that was pumped over the airwaves like this Chinese virus is. I mean, people would be, beside themselves. And here we go, as you've put it, we've shut down a country, but it's amazing how Coles and Woolworths and Audi and Bunnings have all been allowed to stay open, but this has affected many, many small business that will not recover, David.
Yes, there are so many discrepancies in this, and I think trying to do it on a nationwide standard without making sufficient variations across the country is ridiculous. Even within the states, there is great need for variation. Sydney may be a particular problem, but there's no reason why rural New South Wales should be treated like that. Brisbane may be a problem. I don't know how serious that is, but North Queensland doesn't seem to be the same problem. And you can understand the push in North Queensland, very old push, going back to before Federation, to become a separate state. We have mishandled this problem. It's the politicians who've mishandled it. And as I mentioned earlier, the people who are bearing this are the vast mass of ordinary people of Australia. people in the small businesses, in private sector employment and so on. It's the people in the public sector, the politicians and the public servants. And I accept, of course, the frontline people, the nurses and the police. But the great bulk of public servants haven't had to put up with anything, but the rest of the community has. And the politicians have been on top. And when you look at those politicians, you find that almost all of them have never had what could be called a real job. Most of them have been in politics all their life. Correct. Straight to the university and straight from the university into some form of political job. And as soon as they could, straight into parliament, manipulated usually by the power brokers. And it's a situation which is very much a closed shop, but it means they don't have the broad experience that, for example, you have, Peter. And they make decisions which are just very unwise decisions. And could I emphasize that one of the things that runs government these days is computer modeling. They don't make decisions on the facts. They make it on computer modeling, and the modeling they've been using all around the world, from Imperial College London, has been over many times exaggerated. Why somebody didn't notice that on all previous occasions, every projection has been wrong. Now, the politicians are used to this. They're used to using computer modeling because they use this in relation to global warming. And every one of the models, every one has proved to be incorrect. Every model. So what did they do? They turned around. They said, we've got a problem here. We'll change the name of the problem. It's no longer global warming because it's not warming. We're now going to call it climate change. So that's the big problem which drives this country. Little wonder that the National Cabinet has made such a mess of this virus. They've made a mess of just about everything else, the politicians. Just name anything: bushfires, drought, provision of water, cheap electricity, which they took away, reliable electricity, which they took away, standards in education. Everything they do is a mess. Peter.
You're so correct, David, and this computer modelling really gets me, because who's punching the figures into these computers? That's what we've got to really look at. I think what the people that I talk to since this Chinese virus has come out, they're really waking up, because a lot of people that I know are out of work completely, and they're saying, if this goes on, we're never going to recover. And I think if Morrison doesn't do something very, very quick and get people back to work, not 10 in a cafe or 20 meeting here or 30 meeting there, we've got to get back to full working capacity. We really do. And if he doesn't do that, his popularity might be fairly good at the moment, but as we saw with the bushfires, his popularity wasn't very good the way he handled that. And his popularity is going to go down big time, because people need to eat, they need to pay their bills, and they just want to survive. And if they've got no income and no light at the end of the tunnel, they get very, very angry. And I can assure you that this place needs to be open very, very quickly so we can get back to normal. Also, David, I just can't understand why we're not hearing more about kickstarting our manufacturing and our industry. And I know that you and I have talked about this before, but it should already be happening. Where's our plan B? We should be absolutely trying everything possible to start making things here again. And yes, it's going to be a bit dearer, making washing machines or dryers or cars or whatever. But the crap that we're buying at the moment that comes from China doesn't last 2 seconds. I want to be able to buy something that's going to last, made by Australians, jobs for Australians, and something that if I buy a wheelbarrow or a spanner or whatever it may be, I can hand that down to my sons or daughters or grandchildren. I know people that have got wheelbarrows and spanners and different things that their grandparents used to own. But you can't do that with this Chinese stuff. And where's it going? It's all going into our landfill because it only lasts 2 seconds. And how good's that for our environment? It's not good at all. Getting back to our politicians, they haven't taken a pay cut. You know, they get up there and say, oh, look, we feel sorry for everybody out there. They've got no idea. They're still getting paid. The money's going into their bank accounts. Unless you are actually hurting yourself, you've got no idea. And I've been in business, many businesses over the years, and you've got to be thinking all the time. And especially the way governments at the moment keep changing the goalposts on us. We don't know what's going to hit us next. And we can handle drought, us farmers, we can handle fire, we can handle flood. But it's the over-regulation, the red and the green tape that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this has got to stop, David.
Peter, thank you. And we'll conclude in a moment. But can I first say, you raised the question of manufacturing, and I think the whole country is talking about the need to return to manufacturing. I was reading a piece by that old Labour Party grandee, former minister in the Keating and Hawke governments, Graham Richardson. And he was writing about this and saying, yes, it was important. He said, but we can't even go much into aluminium smelting. Now, we ought to be able to do that because we're near the raw product. We ought to be able to give value to that product before it's shipped overseas. And he gives the reason why we can't have more aluminium smelting, and we're probably closing down what we have. It's the electricity. It's too expensive and it's too unreliable. Too expensive and too unreliable. He didn't say why the electricity is too expensive and too unreliable. It's because of every politician in Parliament, because they except the One Nation and some of the minorities. All of the politicians of Labour and Liberals and Nationals are all pushing this ridiculous climate change nonsense. They're all pushing the need to get rid of coal-fired electricity. They're not interested in hydroelectricity because they won't build dams. They're not interested in nuclear electricity. The result is we will always have more and more expensive electricity, and it'll be unreliable. How can we have manufacturing if we have such electricity? And Richardson didn't answer this. The politicians won't answer this because the politicians are not working for Australia. They're working for somebody else. I think tonight, Peter, we've had a very good night. It's been a long session, so I think it might be appropriate to stop there. And thank you so much for your very intelligent comments, your very common sense comments, which I think the listeners, the viewers would really appreciate. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, David. Can I just mention one thing before I go?
Sure.
I'd just like to thank Alan Jones for his tremendous work that he did on 2GB while I was on there for so many, many years, especially sticking up for us mum and dad farmers. There's a guy that wore his heart on his sleeve. He cares about this country, and he is going to be very, very sadly missed. And thank God that he's still on Sky. But Alan, I'd like to wish you all the very best, and thank you for your efforts over the years. And thank you very much, Professor, for the way that you're fighting, not just for us farmers, but you're fighting for true democracy and Australia. And I think it's about time Australians take back your country.
Peter, I would agree entirely. I wrote a piece for Spectator, which anybody can get on the web. Spectator Australia is the name of the magazine. It was called Tribune of the People. The tribunes were the magistrates who were specially appointed to look after the interests of the ordinary people in ancient Rome. And I call this Tribune of the People because that's what Alan Jones is. He is a tribune, the spokesperson, the magistrate on behalf of the ordinary people of Australia. He will continue doing that in a different way, I suppose, from radio. He's going more into television. But we do wish him well and thank him for his many contributions to Australia. Well, thank you very much, Peter. And that is another session in our podcasts.